The room went deathly quiet when my mother-in-law laughed, her voice cutting through the holiday music like a jagged blade. "Oh, don't be silly," she said, waving a manicured hand toward me as 25 of the city's most powerful people stared in confusion. "She isn't family, she's just the help we brought in for the holiday rush. Elena, don't just stand there like a statue. The guests need more champagne." I felt the blood drain from my face as she shoved a heavy silver tray into my hands. I wasn't wearing the emerald silk dress I had picked out for tonight. I was wearing a stiff, black polyester uniform and a white starch apron that felt like a shroud. I looked at the long mahogany table, decorated with gold-leafed pine cones and crystal. There was no seat for me. There was no plate with my name on it. I was the wife of the man sitting at the head of the table. Yet I was being introduced as a servant. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard, I thought it might burst through the cheap fabric of the uniform. This was my life. This was the Vance family. I am Elena, and for 3 long, grueling years, I believed I was the luckiest girl in the world to be married into this wealth. But luck is just a pretty word for a cage when the bars are made of gold. I was 23 years old, a girl with no past and no records, convinced by the woman standing over me that I was a charity case, who deserved nothing more than the scraps from her table. But as I gripped that tray, my knuckles turning white, I didn't know that the nightmare was about to break wide open. The weight of the tray was nothing compared to the weight of the gazes following me. I moved through the dining room, my head bowed, filling glasses with wine that cost more than I had ever seen in my years in the foster system. Every time a guest thanked me, Eleanor would jump in with a sharp remark about my lack of formal training or my clumsiness. She was systematically stripping away my humanity in front of everyone I knew. The Vance estate in Greenwich was a masterpiece of cold, hard luxury. The hallways were lined with mirrors that seemed to mock me, and the air always smelled of expensive lilies, Eleanor's signature scent. It was a place where image was everything. And apparently, tonight, my image was a stain on their reputation. I looked at Mark, my husband. He was busy laughing at a joke made by a senator, refusing to meet my eyes. He knew. He had watched his mother force me into this uniform in the kitchen an hour ago. He had heard her tell me that a girl of my lowly background should be grateful to even be in the same room as the Sterlings. I realized then that the man I had loved for 3 years was a stranger. He wasn't my protector. He was his mother's puppet. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the winter wind howling outside. I was a ghost in my own home, a servant in my own marriage. But the universe has a strange way of balancing the scales. As the front doors groaned open and the guest of honor arrived, the air in the room shifted. Arthur Sterling entered the room like a king, his presence demanding absolute silence. He was a tall man, silver-haired and regal, with eyes that looked like they had seen the very edges of the world. Beside him stood his security detail, men who looked like they were carved out of granite. Eleanor practically tripped over her own feet to reach him, her face twisting into a mask of desperate flattery. "Arthur, we are so honored. Please come in. This is my son, Mark, whom you've heard so much about." I stayed in the shadows by the buffet, my hands trembling. Everyone knew the legend of Arthur Sterling, the man who had everything but the one thing that mattered. 20 years ago, his daughter had been stolen from her carriage in broad daylight. He had spent 2 decades and a fortune trying to find her, turning the country upside down, but the trail had gone cold. He was a man defined by a hole in his heart. I watched as he greeted the guests with a distracted politeness. He looked tired. He looked like a man who was only there because he had to be. As I stepped forward to offer him a glass, my foot caught on the edge of the heavy Persian rug, a rug I had spent 3 hours vacuuming earlier that day under Eleanor's watchful eye. The tray tilted. The crystal flutes began to slide. The sound of clinking glass rang out like a fire alarm in the silent room. I caught the tray just before it hit the floor, but the damage was done. All eyes were on the clumsy servant. Eleanor's face turned a deep, angry purple. "You stupid, worthless girl," she hissed, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "I told you you weren't fit for this. Get out of here and go back to the kitchen where you belong." She stepped toward me, her hand raised as if she were going to strike me right there in front of the elite. But she never got the chance. A hand like a vice gripped my wrist, stopping me from turning away. I looked up, and my breath hitched. It was Arthur Sterling. He wasn't looking at Eleanor. He wasn't looking at the spilled wine. He was staring at my face with an expression of such pure, raw shock that it felt like the world had stopped spinning. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Arthur's face went from pale to a deep, frantic red. He didn't let go of my wrist. Instead, he pulled my arm up into the light of the chandelier, his eyes fixed on the small star-shaped birthmark on the inside of my wrist. It was the mark Eleanor told me was a dirty blemish. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion I couldn't identify. Eleanor scrambled forward, her voice shrill. "Arthur, I am so sorry. This girl is just a temporary worker. She's troubled. She has no family. Elena, leave this instant." "I asked her a question, Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. He didn't move his gaze from mine. "Child, tell me your name. Tell me where you came from." I felt a lump in my throat that made it hard to breathe. "My name is Elena," I whispered. I don't know where I came from. I was raised in foster homes in Pennsylvania. My records don't start until I was 4 years old." Arthur let out a sound that was half sob, half roar. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet, opening it to a photograph. He held it up to my face. The woman in the photo had my dark curls, my high cheekbones, and the exact same star-shaped birthmark on her wrist. She was holding a baby. "This is my wife, Juliana," Arthur said, his voice echoing through the silent dining room. "She died of a broken heart because our daughter was stolen. My daughter was 3 years old when she was taken. Her name was Elizabeth." The room felt like it was tilting on its axis. I looked at the woman in the photo. It was like looking into a mirror. I realized then that the missing year of my life, the gap between being taken at 3 and appearing in the system at 4, was the year Eleanor and her family had spent scrubbing my identity from the earth. Eleanor tried to grab my arm to pull me away, but Arthur shoved her back with a force that sent her stumbling into the table. "Don't you touch her," he warned. "Don't you ever touch her again." "You've had her here the whole time?" Arthur asked, his voice shaking with a rage so cold it felt like ice. He turned to the room, to the guests who were now whispering in horror. "You told me your son married a girl from a modest background, Eleanor. You told me she was away on a trip. You lied to me for 3 years while my daughter was under your roof, scrubbing your floors?" Mark stepped forward, his hands raised in a plea. "Arthur, please, we didn't know. My mother found her through an agency." But Arthur cut him off with a look of pure disgust. "The agency your family owns, Mark? The one I've been investigating for years for human trafficking? I never thought the trail would lead to my own friends. I never thought you'd be the ones holding my child hostage." I stood there, the silver tray still in my hand, feeling the weight of 20 years of lies finally breaking. I wasn't a nothing. I wasn't a charity case. I was Elizabeth Sterling. Every insult Eleanor had hurled at me, every time she made me sleep in the guest wing or the basement, every time she told me I was lucky to even have a name. It was all a psychological prison. She hadn't rescued me. She had stolen me twice, once from my father and once from myself. I looked at the black uniform I was wearing and felt a surge of power I had never known. I dropped the tray. The sound of silver hitting the floor was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The atmosphere in the room shifted from a festive gala to a crime scene in a matter of seconds. Arthur didn't wait for permission. He barked orders to his security team, and within moments the exits were blocked. No one was leaving. Eleanor was screaming about her rights and her reputation, but Arthur ignored her as if she were a buzzing insect. He stayed by my side, his hand never leaving my shoulder. It was the first time in 3 years I felt like I wasn't going to fall through the floor. "I need a doctor and my legal team here now," Arthur commanded into his phone. He looked at me, his eyes softening. "I'm so sorry, Elizabeth. I'm so sorry it took me this long." I looked over at Mark, who was sitting slumped in a chair, his face buried in his hands. He wasn't crying, he was shaking. He knew the Vance empire was crumbling. He had been a silent partner in my misery, enjoying the sterling trust funds that Eleanor had been illegally siphoning through a loophole she created using my false identity. He had known I was special, but he was too weak to ask why. I realized then that their love for me was just a way to keep the sterling heir under their thumb. If Arthur ever died, they would have had total control over the sterling fortune through me. It was a long game, and I was the pawn. The next few hours were a blur of intense activity. Arthur's personal physician arrived with a mobile testing kit, his face grave as he realized the gravity of the situation. While they took my DNA, Arthur's lawyers began sequestering the house staff. They found a woman named Maria, a housekeeper who had been with the Vances for 20 years. When she saw me standing with Arthur, she broke down in tears. "I knew it," she sobbed. "I saw the photos in the papers years ago. I told Eleanor the girl looked like the sterling baby, and she threatened to have me deported if I ever said a word." The evidence was mounting faster than Eleanor could keep up with. In the library, Arthur's tech team began bypassing the Vance security servers. They found encrypted files linked to the Vance private adoption agency. These weren't just adoption records, they were invoices. Payments made to a couple in Pennsylvania to lose a 3-year-old girl and ensure she was never processed through official channels until she turned 4. Eleanor hadn't just found me. She had orchestrated my disappearance to ensure I would be available for her son to marry when the time was right. She had raised me in the system, from a distance, like a farmer tending to a crop she intended to harvest. By 4 a.m., the rapid DNA results were ready. The doctor walked into the library where we were waiting. He didn't even have to speak. The look on his face said everything. He handed the tablet to Arthur, who looked at the screen and let out a choked sob. 99.9%, Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "You're my daughter. You're my little Libby." He pulled me into a hug, and for the first time in my life, I felt the warmth of a parent. It wasn't the cold, conditional approval of the Vances. It was the unconditional love of a father who had never stopped looking. I turned to see the police entering the foyer. Arthur had called in every favor he had. The Vances were being led out in handcuffs. Eleanor was still shouting, her voice hoarse, accusing me of being a con artist. But then the lead detective held up a folder they had found in her private safe. It contained my original birth certificate and a lock of my hair from when I was a baby. She had kept them as trophies of her victory over the Sterlings. As they led her past me, I stepped forward. I took the white servant's apron off and threw it at her feet. "I'm not your servant anymore, Eleanor," I said, my voice steady. "And you're not a queen, you're just a thief who got caught." As the sun began to rise on Christmas morning, the Vance mansion felt like a hollow shell. The police were cataloging evidence, and the guests had long since been escorted out, sworn to secrecy until the official press release. Arthur led me to his car, a massive black SUV that felt like a fortress. "We're going home, Elizabeth," he said, "to the real home." As we drove away, I looked out the window at the falling snow. For the last 20 years I had been told I was a nobody. I had been taught to apologize for taking up space. I had been told that my only value was in serving others. But as the Greenwich gates faded into the distance, I felt a new version of myself taking root. I wasn't Alina anymore, the girl who was afraid of her mother-in-law's shadow. I was Elizabeth Sterling. I thought about all the other children who might be trapped in the private system Eleanor had built, and I knew that my wealth and my name weren't just for me. They were a weapon. I looked at the birthmark on my wrist. Eleanor called it a blemish, but it was actually my North Star. It had led my father back to me. The nightmare was over, but the work was just beginning. I was no longer a servant. I was the heir to an empire, and I was going to make sure the Vances never hurt anyone ever again. The drive to the Sterling estate was quiet, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are trying to process a miracle. I watched the snow-covered trees pass by and thought about my life just 24 hours ago. I had been worried about burning the roast or folding the napkins wrong. Now, I was sitting in a car that cost more than the Vances' entire fleet, headed toward a life I couldn't even imagine. Arthur reached over and squeezed my hand. "I know this is a lot, Elizabeth. We will take it slow. You don't have to be anyone but yourself." I nodded, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. I don't even know who myself is yet, I admitted. Arthur smiled sadly. We have the rest of our lives to find out. When we pulled through the massive iron gates of the Sterling property, my breath caught. It wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary. Stone walls, ivy-covered turrets, and windows that glowed with a warm, welcoming light. It looked nothing like the cold, modern prison the Vances lived in. As we walked through the front doors, a line of staff stood waiting. I flinched instinctively, expecting them to look at me with the same disdain Eleanor's staff had. But they didn't. They were all smiling, some with tears in their eyes. An older woman stepped forward, wiping her cheeks with her apron. "Welcome home, Miss Elizabeth," she whispered. "We never stopped praying for this day." Arthur led me up a grand staircase to a wing of the house that had been kept closed for 2 decades. He pushed open a set of double doors, and I stepped into a world of soft pinks, creams, and gold. It was a bedroom suite that belonged in a fairy tale. "I updated the clothes and the tech every few years," Arthur said, gesturing to the walk-in closet. "I wanted it to be ready, just in case." I walked over to the vanity and saw a silver-framed photo of a baby being held by the woman from Arthur's wallet. I realized that while I was being treated like dirt by the Vances, this man was keeping my memory alive in every corner of his home. I turned to him, my voice trembling. "Why did Eleanor do it? She has so much money already. Why steal a child just to make her a servant?" Arthur's face darkened. It wasn't just about money, though the Sterling trust is immense. It was about control. Eleanor's father was a rival of mine. He lost everything in a bad business deal with me. Eleanor grew up hating the Sterlings. She didn't just want my money, she wanted to break my spirit. She wanted to take the most precious thing I had and turn it into something she could mock. I felt a shiver. The level of malice required to raise a child in servitude just to spite a rival was beyond my understanding. But Eleanor wasn't a normal woman. She was a hollow person filled with nothing but gold and bitterness. That first night at the Sterling estate, I didn't sleep in that windowless room in the guest wing or on the cold basement floor. I slept in a bed with silk sheets and a duvet that felt like a cloud. But I woke up at 5 a.m., my heart racing, thinking I had missed my alarm to start the Vance breakfast. I was halfway out of bed, looking for my apron, before I remembered where I was. I sat back down and burst into tears. It was the first time I had let myself really cry. I cried for the little girl who didn't understand why she wasn't allowed to go to school. I cried for the teenager who was told she was too ugly to be seen by guests. And I cried for the woman who had almost lost her soul to a family of monsters. A soft knock came at the door. It was the woman from the hallway, Mrs. Higgins. She was carrying a tray with tea and fresh biscuits. "I thought you might be awake, dear," she said gently. "Habits are hard to break." She set the tray down and sat on the edge of the bed. "I worked for your mother, you know. You have her eyes, but you have your father's chin." I took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through me. "Tell me about her," I begged. For the next hour she told me about Juliana Sterling, how she loved to garden, and how she once rescued a stray dog from a storm. I listened to every word, hungry for the pieces of myself I had been denied. By the afternoon, the news had broken. "Sterling heiress found in Vance Mansion" was the headline on every news site. Arthur's legal team was working around the clock. They found evidence that Eleanor had used a series of shell companies to pay off the corrupt social workers who had lost my paperwork. She had even falsified a death certificate for Elizabeth Sterling to stop the official search. My existence had been scrubbed from the world so she could recreate me as Elena, the nobody. Mark's involvement was more complicated. While he hadn't known about the kidnapping, he had benefited from the Sterling trust funds that Eleanor had been illegally siphoning through a loophole. He had also been complicit in the emotional abuse. Arthur didn't care about the nuances. "Anyone who saw you suffer and did nothing is an enemy," he told me firmly. We spent the day in his study, going through legal documents. I had to sign papers to reclaim my legal identity. Seeing the name Elizabeth Juliana Sterling on a birth certificate made it feel real. I wasn't a foster kid anymore. I wasn't a Vance. I was someone with a history that went back generations. But even with all the wealth and the protection, I felt a lingering fear. Eleanor was powerful. Even from a jail cell, she felt like a shadow hanging over me. I knew the battle wasn't over until she was behind bars for life. A week later, I received a letter from jail. It was from Mark. My father didn't want me to read it, but I needed to know what he had to say. The letter was filled with apologies and excuses. He claimed he loved me, and that he was a victim of his mother's manipulation too. He begged me to use my influence with Arthur to drop the charges against him. I read the letter twice, then walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the flames. Mark didn't love me. He loved the idea of a wife who wouldn't talk back, someone he could control just as his mother controlled him. If he had truly loved me, he would have noticed that his wife didn't have a social security number or a past. He would have asked why his mother treated me like a slave. His silence was his choice, and now he had to live with the consequences. Arthur walked in and saw the charred remains of the letter. "Are you okay?" he asked. I looked at him and realized I felt stronger than I ever had. "I'm fine, Dad. I'm better than fine." Hearing me call him Dad for the first time made his eyes light up. It was a small word, but it carried the weight of 20 years. We decided then that we wouldn't just sit back and wait for the trial. We were going to start a foundation, in my mother's name, to help children who were lost in the foster system. The trial of Eleanor Vance was the event of the year. I had to testify. I spent weeks preparing with my father's lawyers, but nothing could prepare me for seeing Eleanor in her orange jumpsuit. She looked older, smaller, but her eyes were still full of venom. When I took the stand, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The defense attorney tried to paint me as a gold digger who had tricked the Vances into marriage, but my father's team was ready. They presented the DNA evidence, the falsified records, and the testimony of the former housekeepers who had seen Eleanor strike me with her cane. As I spoke, I felt my voice growing steadier. I told the jury about the 5 a.m. alarms, the cold guest wing room, and the way Eleanor would make me eat in the pantry while they had Christmas dinner. I looked Eleanor straight in the eye and said, "You tried to take my name, my family, and my future. But you forgot one thing. You can't take the truth." The jury didn't even need 2 hours to deliberate. Eleanor was found guilty on all counts: kidnapping, human trafficking, and grand larceny. She was sentenced to 30 years without the possibility of parole. Mark was sentenced to 5 years for his role in the financial fraud. As they led Eleanor out of the courtroom, she screamed at me, "You'll always be a servant, Elena. You'll never be one of us." I just smiled. She was right. I would never be like her. And that was the greatest victory of all. After the trial, the world felt different. The weight that had been on my chest for 3 years was finally gone. My father and I flew to a private island to escape the media circus. For the first time, I learned how to swim, how to drive a boat, and how to just be. I realized that the unrefined girl Eleanor had mocked was actually quite smart and capable. I started reading the books I had been denied and discovered a passion for law. I wanted to become a lawyer so I could fight the very system that had failed me. Arthur was my biggest supporter. He sat with me through my entrance exam prep, cheering me on like I was a kid again. One evening, as we sat on the beach watching the sunset, he turned to me. "Elizabeth, I want you to know that the sterling fortune is yours to do with as you wish, but your mother's greatest legacy wasn't the money. It was her kindness. I see that in you every day." I looked at the star birthmark on my wrist, now glowing in the orange light of the sun. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a person with a purpose. I had been raised as a servant, but I had learned more about strength and resilience than any of the people at that Christmas dinner combined. I was ready to go back to the world and start my real life. Returning to the city was different this time. I wasn't hiding in the back of a car. I was the one deciding where we went. We officially launched the Juliana and Elizabeth Foundation. At the opening gala, I didn't wear a servant's uniform. I wore a stunning emerald silk gown that matched my eyes. I stood at the podium and looked out at a room full of people who wanted to help. I told them my story, not as a victim, but as a call to action. The system isn't broken. I told them. It was built to keep people like me invisible. We are here to shine a light. The response was overwhelming. We raised millions in one night. But the best part of the evening was when a young girl, a foster child herself, came up to me and asked for my autograph. "I want to be like you," she whispered. I knelt down so I was eye level with her. "Don't be like me," I said gently. "Be yourself, because you are already enough, just as you are." That moment meant more to me than any of the headlines or the money. I was finally using my past to build a better future for someone else. I felt a sense of peace that I had never known. The girl who was raised as a maid was now a woman who moved mountains, and I knew my mother would be proud. As the years passed, the memories of the Vance house began to fade, replaced by new ones. I graduated from law school at the top of my class. My father was there, beaming with pride as I walked across the stage. I eventually met someone who loved me for who I was, not for my name or my money. He was a simple architect who didn't care about social status. When he proposed, he didn't do it at a grand gala. He did it in the garden of my father's house, surrounded by the lilies my mother loved. We had a small wedding, just family and close friends. There were no servants there, only people who cared about us. I made sure that the catering staff was treated with the utmost respect, and I even took a moment to thank each of them personally. I never wanted anyone to feel the way I had felt at that Christmas dinner. Life was finally good. But I never forgot where I came from. Every Christmas, my father and I go to the local shelter and serve dinner to the homeless. I wear an apron, but this time, I wear it with pride. It's a reminder that service isn't about being less than someone, it's about being more. It's about having the heart to give when you have nothing, and the grace to lead when you have everything. One day, I got a call from the prison. Eleanor Vance was dying, and she wanted to see me. My father told me I didn't have to go, but I felt I needed to close that chapter once and for all. When I walked into the infirmary, I hardly recognized her. The woman who had once been so terrifying was now just a frail, gray shadow. She looked at me, and for a moment the old fire flickered in her eyes. "You came," she rasped. "I wanted to see if I had truly failed. I wanted to see if you had turned into one of them." I sat down by her bed. "I didn't turn into one of them, Eleanor. I turned into myself. I'm a lawyer, a wife, and a daughter, and I'm happy." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. "Happy? What a boring thing to be. I had power, Elena. I had the world at my feet." She still used that false name, an act of defiance even now. I shook my head. "No, you had a house built on lies, and it fell. I have a life built on truth, and it's standing tall." She didn't say anything after that. She just turned her head away. I left the prison feeling a strange sense of closure. I didn't hate her anymore. Hate takes too much energy, and I had better things to do with my life. I walked out into the sunshine and took a deep breath. I was free. Truly, completely free. The legacy of the Sterlings continued to grow. My father and I became the faces of a movement to reform child welfare laws. We passed the Elizabeth Act, which mandated stricter background checks and digital tracking for all foster placements to ensure no child could ever be lost again. It was a long, hard fight, but every time I felt like giving up, I remembered the cold basement floor in the Vance house. I remembered the sound of the rattan cane, and I kept going. My brother, Mark, was eventually released from prison. He was sentenced to 5 years, but served only 3 due to good behavior, a standard release for a first-time non-violent offender. He tried to contact me several times, but I never answered. He had to build his own life now, without his mother's shadow, and without my father's money. I hoped he would find a way to be a better man, but that wasn't my burden to carry. I had my own family now. I had a son and a daughter who grew up knowing they were loved, wanted, and safe. I told them the story of their grandmother Juliana, and I told them about the importance of kindness. I never hid my past from them. I wanted them to know that strength comes from overcoming, not from having things easy. Looking back on that Christmas dinner, I realize it was the best and worst day of my life. It was the day my world ended and the day my life began. If Arthur Sterling hadn't looked up at that exact moment, if he hadn't seen my face, I might still be in that house, folding towels and staying out of sight. It's a terrifying thought. It reminds me that life is made of small moments that change everything. People often ask how Arthur never saw me in 3 years, but the truth was simple. Eleanor made sure I was always traveling or ill during the rare occasions our paths might have crossed at galas. She was arrogant enough to think she could hide a person in plain sight. I think about my mother often. I like to think she was there that night, nudging Arthur's gaze toward me. I like to think she's watching now, seeing the woman I've become. My father passed away peacefully a few years ago, but he died knowing he had found his daughter. He died happy, and I carry his love with me every day. The Sterling name is no longer just a symbol of wealth, it's a symbol of hope. And every year, when the snow starts to fall and the Christmas lights go up, I take a moment to look in the mirror. I don't see a servant, I don't see a victim. I see Elizabeth Sterling. The story of the servant bride became a legend in our town, but to me, it was just the truth of how I found my way home. I learned that you can't choose where you start, but you can choose where you finish. I learned that family isn't about blood as much as it is about who stands by you when the world is dark. The Vances had my blood through marriage, but they were never my family. Arthur was my family before the DNA test even proved it. He was the one who fought for me. He was the one who saw me when I was invisible. That is what love is. It's seeing the person behind the apron. It's knowing their worth when they've forgotten it themselves. I try to live my life with that same vision. I try to see the people the world ignores. Because you never know who is waiting to be found. You never know whose life can be changed by a single look of recognition. I am proof that miracles happen, but they often need a little help from the truth. My life had been scrubbed and rewritten by someone else, but I finally held the pen. As I sit here writing this, my daughter is playing in the garden, and my husband is laughing at something on the porch. The world is at peace. I think about the girl I was, the one who was afraid to speak, the one who thought she was born to serve. I wish I could go back and tell her that it gets better. I wish I could tell her that she is a Sterling, but then again, maybe she needed to go through that darkness to appreciate the light this much. Maybe we all need a little winter to make the spring feel so sweet. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just grateful. Grateful for the birthmark on my wrist. Grateful for a father who never stopped looking. And even grateful for that clumsy moment with the tray that started it all. If I hadn't tripped, Arthur might have never looked up. My life is a series of beautiful accidents that led me to the truth. And the truth is the most powerful thing in the world. I am finally exactly where I belong. So if you're reading this and you feel like you're invisible or like you're trapped in a life that isn't yours, don't give up. Keep your head up, because someone might be looking for you right now. Someone might see your face and recognize a piece of themselves. You are not a servant to your past. You are the master of your future. I am Elizabeth Sterling, and I am finally, truly home. The Christmas lights are twinkling in the trees outside, and for the first time in 23 years, I'm not the one hanging them because I have to. I'm hanging them because I want to. Because this is my house, this is my family, and this is my life. The story that started with a servant at a dinner party ends with a woman who knows her worth. If this story of reclaiming my identity moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe to hear more stories of strength and truth. I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own life? Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Your engagement helps ensure that no one else has to feel invisible. Merry Christmas to everyone, and remember, you are more than the labels people put on you. You are extraordinary. You are wanted. You are enough. Just like my mother always wanted me to know.